Want to thank you for joining me again for our study of the book of Isaiah. I'll ask, if you will, to please be turning to chapter 42 as we move along in this last section of the book of Isaiah, which is a much different tone than the first 35 chapters. Chapters 40 through 66 is much more comforting and hopeful in nature. And we see many things as it relates to the Messiah in this section. As a matter of fact, we're going to be looking at chapter 42. We're starting chapter 42 today. And this chapter contains the first of four so called songs of the servant or servant songs. Scholars have debated this concept of this servant for some time. And there's apparently more than one addressed as we look at the context overall. But the servant above all others, and the servant toward which now Isaiah is moving in his message, is going to be the Messiah and the suffering servant that Jesus was portrayed to be. So, first of all, let's look at the messianic servant of the Lord in chapter 42, verses 1 through 4. Behold, my servant whom I uphold, my elect one, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the Gentiles. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed he shall not break, and smoking flax he will not quench. He will bring forth justice for truth. He will not fail nor be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands shall wait for his law. Well, I'm a firm believer and have always taught that if we're going to understand the essence of a passage, yes, we have a historical context in which to find it. Here, you're looking at a servant being spoken of. You see the future tense being used of this one. But we see more than one servant in these following chapters. As a matter of fact, when we get up to chapters 44 and 45, we're going to see Cyrus being referred to as a servant. And then later on, we might even see the remnant themselves being, in a sense, the servant. But all of those are moving toward the great servant that's being spoken of here. The true hope that anybody has is seen in the Messiah. And that is the direction that Isaiah was inspired to take these, these thoughts. In verse 1, as indicated in 41:8, let's look back at that for just a minute. Let's review here. But you, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the descendants of Abraham, my friend. So you're looking at Israel, Jacob, and Abraham being referenced there. I believe we need to go back to the promise of Abraham, and specifically the seed promise that was made in Genesis chapter 12. Through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Well, that was reiterated to Isaac, and it was reiterated to Jacob. And then it came through Judah as we see this line come. That's messianic in nature, and we're looking at all of these that have some role in God's unfolding plan to bring this servant. That's the one that Isaiah is referring to here. He's not contradicting chapter 41, verse 8. He's not pitting two servants against each other. On the contrary, he's showing the tandem nature of these servants. And you're going to bring Cyrus in the same way. We're looking at basically three references to a servant that's going to be now carried through this, but it's all still one plan. It's all still one line, one basic premise that was being made here in this passage. So the servant in chapter 41 was Israel. Here it's expanded, and Christ is referenced in that capacity. Now we know this because this is confirmed by Matthew. We're not going to take the time to turn there, but you might jot down Matthew chapter 12, verses 18 through 21, because that's going to be the context that we're going to see as it relates to this passage. Again, when we understand the passage, one of the best ways to understand it is see how it's used, excuse me, when it's quoted elsewhere. This passage is quoted in the context of Matthew chapter 12. It's quoted in verses 18 through 21. But let's set the seed for this quote. That great chapter is the occasion where Jesus and his disciples were walking through a field, a grain field, and they were gathering grain to eat as in that context. When that was seen by the scribes and the Pharisees, they claimed that they were breaking Mosaic law. They claimed that they were breaking the Sabbath. In reality, if we go back and do a lesson on the Sabbath, getting that to eat was not the sin. If they had been gathering it to sell, or if they had been gathering it to store up, that would have been a violation, but not what was shown here. But Jesus dealt with an even greater principle. He says, there's not a one of you here, if you lost a sheep on the Sabbath day, that you would not go look for it. We think about the ox in the ditch illustration. If an ox fell into the ditch on the Sabbath day, you could get that ox out. That's not working. It's not in the same way or the same spirit that the Sabbath was addressing. So he was exposing the Pharisees' misrepresentation. And likely it was because they were trying to find a way to trap Jesus. Well, in the midst of that context, Isaiah 2, 1 through 4 is, Isaiah 42, 1 through 4 is quoted, indicating again that God would fully equip his servant for the task at hand. It's a servant being referenced there. It's a servant being emphasized in Matthew chapter 12. Error is exposed in between. But there we have one passage explaining another. Matthew chapter 12, verses 18 through 21, quotes this passage and shows that it's Christ that's being spoken of. There again is our evidence for how we see that passage being used. Now, this could be what's referenced in Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 16. Let's go ahead and look over there. Excuse me, Matthew chapter 3 and verse 16. When he had been baptized, Jesus came up immediately from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and ascending upon him. And suddenly a voice came from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The task of the servant who was to come was to bring justice to the nations. That's referenced there again in Isaiah 42, but we see that's exactly what Jesus did. Jesus brought justice as it relates to his role, and justice as it related to God's wrath upon sin and the deliverance of that through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Now, most nations, including ourselves, think of branches of judgment. We have legislative, we have executive, and we have judicial. And we see those as being separate. The Hebrews saw all of that pulled together and saw God as the judge over all of these things. So when you're looking at the concept of justice, it's more far reaching than just the court system. It could be any aspect of that, and all law was under God. We're going to see later. Jesus says, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. We look at John chapter 12, verses 48 to 50, and we see indeed that the words that Jesus spoke are what's going to judge us on the last day. In verses 2 through 4, we see verses 2 and 3 first of all, and it contains 5 negative verbs describing the unobstructive nature of the servant's work. Let's look at that again. Verses 2 and 3. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor cause his voice to be heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and smoking flax he will not quench. So you're looking at 5 negative verbs that are spoken of there. But what we're looking at here is the sharp contrast that is drawn. Now, remember, Sennacherib had been a key figure here. And I think we can go back to Sennacherib and see a comparison and contrast with Christ to show the difference here. Sennacherib was one who was boasting. We go back to that historical interlude of Isaiah 36 through 39, that middle section between these two larger sections of the book. And he had already been successful. He had already taken numerous cities, and he was approaching Hezekiah. And remember, we indicated on his prism, he said, I had Hezekiah shut up as a bird in a cage. We see the arrogance that's there. We see emissaries that are sent, and basically the people are told, you have no hope. We see a powerful army. There was confidence, but that was boasting words of Sennacherib. In one night, his army was wiped out. He was shown that he was not the power that he claimed to be, nor were his gods the power that he claimed for them. But Jesus here is not going to just be boasting. He's not coming forward just to say things. He's coming forward to dispense justice. He's going to establish it, he's going to dispense it as it relates to God's word. A second justice statement draws attention to the servant's faithfulness in completing his task here. He is not bringing the possibility of justice. He is coming to put justice in place. When we look at reality today, when we look at salvation today, we see that God is a just God. Those who live according to his will, who have submitted themselves to his will, are going to be blessed. Those who reject his will, those who oppose those who accept his will. We're seeing a sharp line of contrast being drawn, and the blessing and the judgment, negative judgment that comes, are both part of justice. That's the justice that's being spoken of. We're going to see justice that is going to have its final say at the last day, when final sentencing is brought in to separate the righteous from the evil. When we die, yes, we're already judged to some extent. We either go to paradise or Tartarus in the Hadean realm. Some sense of judgment has to be made. Some sense of justice is already carried out there. That's going to be seen in its fullest sense when Jesus comes back and brings an end to all things, where he will eventually turn the kingdom back over to God and take his place with us in submission. This section is the first of three different announcements that Isaiah is going to make, that even far off coastlands would rejoice in the Messiah's work. We're going to see that in chapter 51, verse 5, and we're going to see that in chapter 60 and verse 9. Nothing is going to hinder the Messiah, from doing his work. Is that not the key point in Acts chapter 2? Death did not stop it. Rome couldn't stop it. The scribes and the Pharisees couldn't stop it. He was put to death as that was God's will. Isaiah 53, he came here to die. Suffering Messiah is what he came to be. But nothing could stop God's plan from being carried out. The church was established. Nothing is going to stop Jesus from coming back and bringing these things in. There is no human element that can stop God's plan from happening. Yes, human elements have a part in determining who's going to be where in the judgment. We go to the lost and we evangelize, or we get our own life set straight. We stumble, we fall, we repent, we're brought back into a right relationship. That's human involvement. But Jesus is coming back. And Philippians 2 says, every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Sadly, for many, it's going to be too late. We have atheists, we have agnostics, we have numerous different sources today that deny the reality of God. I saw on a meme just yesterday Stephen Hawking basically saying the Bible is weak people's comfort because they're afraid of the dark. Oftentimes, I've seen the Bible portrayed as a crutch for weak people. Those people can make those claims all day long. They can deny God all day long. They can mock His church today, but they can't stop judgment from happening. And one day, they will acknowledge what we are claiming today, that Jesus Christ is Lord, and salvation only comes through Him. Now, we move into our next section, and this is chapter 42, verses 5 through 9. The Lord confirms the servant's work. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth the earth and that which comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it, and spirit to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness, and will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. So he's still talking about the servant's work in the future, but he's talking about confirming that work here now. In verse 5, according to Shackelford in his commentary, he said this: four participles are used here to describe the unchanging relationship of God with mankind: created, stretched out, spread, and gives. God, the mighty one, and the Lord Yahweh, the God of the covenant, are used together in this verse for emphasis. Remember that we may be looking at different nuances of the two names, but also repetition was a key aspect of Hebrew rhetoric to make the emphasis here. God, I'm the God who's going to do this. I'm offering these things. I'm stretching out. He's establishing a relationship with man. He's going to maintain a relationship with man. It was that way under the Mosaic system as it relates to these people. The Mosaic system provided an opportunity for a relationship with God. God offered the covenant. God set the terms for the covenant, but the people had the responsibility to respond in obedient faith. It's going to be the same way in the work of the servant. The servant is going to live and die under the Old Testament system, but he's ushering in a new and a better relationship. The book of Hebrews bears that out. God is extending the opportunity through the servant, through the Son, for us to have this relationship together. He's reaching out, He's stretching out, He's giving us these things. Yet, man still must respond in obedient faith to God's parameters that are established in that covenant. Isaiah prophesied about 740 BC, and he saw Israel, the 10 northern tribes, go into captivity. Why? Because they rejected the covenant. They set up their own gods. They set up their own system. They sought their own way to do these things. Trust in God was what they needed to hear. It's the same way with the two southern tribes of Judah. They were not to trust in alliances. They were to trust in God. God was going to care for them. It was God that established the covenant, not that rock that they carved. And the servant who is to come, God's setting the parameters through him, and we need to trust in him in that context. In verse 6, we see the usage of a phrase, I am the Lord. Now, remember, when we see the frequency of phrases, it's important for us to recognize that that's an important concept. And when we see something happen numerous times, it ought to be something that gets our attention. It's a flag that's waving. This phrase, I am the Lord, occurs 12 times in Isaiah 40 through 48. That establishes itself as a major theme. I am the Lord, not these gods, not what you want to set up. In each case, a statement is made of God's unique relationship to his people as the one true God. So many were guilty of idolatry. So many had rejected the will of God, which means they rejected God and they made their own God in his place. But God says, I'm God. I'm the one who established the only relationship. This servant that we're still looking at involved a covenant. It was a new covenant. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34, speaks of the day when that law that was written on stone is going to be no more. It's going to be replaced by a law that's written on the heart. This servant came to usher in a new covenant that began with John's baptism, John the Baptist. Those who were baptized, however, with John were told that there's one coming greater. They needed to follow Christ. And then on Pentecost Day, we see the church established and we see the parameters through the gospel message that determine the relationship that man enjoys with God. The overall theme is the same. Trust God, not our way. And that's what we see in that passage. Now, God's relationship to his people is a key aspect of what's being discussed in this context. And this relationship here is extended to the nations to indicate that the servant is a covenant to show that all the blessings of the covenant are embodied in and have their origin and root in him. The Messiah is the servant. But the Messiah is not the one who established the covenant. We see God the Father established the covenant. The Messiah, Christ, was the servant through whom that came, how it was delivered, and how the foundation of it for it was laid in the death, burial, and resurrection of that servant. When you look at Isaiah 53, it's about the crucifixion. That's because the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ are all essential components to the gospel message. Look at Romans chapter 6 and see how that comparison is made. Christ died, was buried, and raised again. Man is to die to sin, to be buried in the water of baptism, to be raised in a newness of life. That suffering servant is the one who brought that concept in and serves as the core of that foundation. Covenant blessings were directly tied to the blood of Christ and his resurrection from the dead. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 20. Let's see if we can't get through this, and we'll stop at verse 9 today. When you look at verse 7, some think this verse has a reference to the return from captivity. It might be an initial understanding of it. It seems to speak more of the salvation of both Jews and Gentiles here. Now, this is why I say it was an initial part of it. When we see the remnant come back from the land, there are three prophets left to prophesy: Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. And all three have a different message, and that message is Messiah is coming. So this is why I tie the two together. I don't see them as being mutually exclusive, that here's the captivity and then here is Christ coming. It's all part of the plan. It's a plan that continues to flow until we get up to the point where Christ was born. But here's the whole point. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 17 through 20 indicates that salvation of both Jews and Gentiles through Christ is what's being referenced for the end of the fulfillment of what we see here in chapter 42. In verse 8, the words of this verse remind us of God's words at the burning bush, Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 to 15. That's where he revealed his covenant name to Moses. In Semitic languages, a name expresses the person's nature. We've seen the importance of the names of people in the Old Testament as it relates to what's going on. Lord expresses the personal and unchanging reality of the one true God. Only He is to be worshiped and served. They were taught that all the way back at the giving of the law in Deuteronomy chapter 4. In John chapter 4, verse 24, Jesus indicates that there's one God and He's the only one worthy of worship. We're to worship Him in spirit and in truth. And then lastly, in verse 9, just as God's prophecies through the prophets have been fulfilled, so other predictions are going to come to pass. There's more than one prophecy that's being addressed. There's going to be later prophets. As a matter of fact, you look at Isaiah, Jeremiah chronologically would be next, Daniel, Ezekiel. We look at the minor prophets, all of these. In other words, there's many more things going to be said, and they're going to be true. This is going to be true. God is going to fulfill what He said. His promise of redemption is sure because He said it is. There's our confidence. There's our hope. Heaven is real because God said it is. Salvation through Christ is a reality because God said it is. We have hope in eternal life because God had said that we can. Thank you again for joining me on this study. We'll pick up in verse 10 in our next session. Until then, God bless you.